My sister smacked my baby at Christmas dinner, said I was overreacting. Everyone just sat there silently, but then my military commander husband stood up, stared her straight in the eye, and said, "Get out." She never returned. Do you know what it feels like to witness something so shocking, so utterly wrong, that it rips through your entire sense of reality? Last Christmas, I lived that nightmare. My own sister, Vanessa, slapped my 6-month-old baby, Lucas, right across the face during dinner. And what happened next? Well, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They all just sat there frozen. But then my husband, David, a military commander, stood up. And in that terrifying silence, he looked her dead in the eye and said 2 words that changed our lives forever. "Hi, I'm Natalie." Last Christmas, December 23rd to be exact, was supposed to be a joyous reunion. My husband, David, had just returned from a 6-month deployment overseas. We'd driven 3 hours from Fort Henderson to introduce our baby boy, Lucas, to his grandparents for his very first Christmas. But my sister, Vanessa, always had a way of making everything about her. The Sterling family Christmas dinner had always been Vanessa's show, and this year was no different. She arrived 2 hours late in her white Tesla, dragging in ring lights and a camera crew. Her mission? To document her authentic family Christmas experience for her lifestyle blog. I stood in the kitchen doorway, gently bouncing Lucas, who was fussing from a disrupted nap. I watched my mother, Patricia, rearrange the entire dining room to accommodate Vanessa's filming setup. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey, but underneath it all, there was that familiar Sterling family tension. My father, Robert, sat in his usual corner chair, scrolling through his phone, perfecting his art of selective blindness. He'd mastered it over the years, especially when it came to Vanessa's constant drama. Vanessa had been hyping this dinner for weeks online, calling it her family gratitude special. She'd promised an intimate look at holiday traditions. She conveniently omitted that David had just gotten back from a war zone, or that we were bringing our baby for his first ever family holiday. None of that mattered when it came to Vanessa's narrative. David emerged from the guest bedroom, where he'd been changing Lucas's diaper. He looked sharp in his dress uniform, carrying himself with that quiet authority that came from years of leading soldiers. He caught my eye across the room, gave me one of those small smiles that meant everything would be okay, even when I wasn't sure it would be. The dining room now looked like a magazine spread. Vanessa had relocated my grandmother's antique candlesticks for her equipment, moved family photos for better angles, and even swapped out the napkins for ones that photographed better. She directed her cameraman around the table like a commercial director, which in many ways she was. Mom bustled around her, making sure everything met Vanessa's exacting standards. The turkey, now under heat lamps to maintain its appearance, and side dishes were rearranged endlessly. Even the flowers had been swapped for a more photogenic arrangement Vanessa brought. I'd learned long ago not to comment. Growing up, pointing out the absurdity was met with lectures about supporting family and understanding bigger dreams. The implication was always clear. I was small-minded, jealous, threatened by her ambition. David helped me set Lucas in the high chair, a solid wood heirloom from David's grandmother that looked oddly out of place among Vanessa's curated aesthetic. Lucas gurgled happily, reaching for his toys, completely unaware he was about to become an unwitting part of his aunt's content creation. The meal began with Vanessa's customary gratitude speech, delivered directly to her camera. We all sat in awkward silence. She talked about traditions, togetherness, how blessed she felt to share these moments with her followers. 10 minutes, and she managed not to mention David's deployment, Lucas's first Christmas, or anything specific about the actual people at the table. When she finally signaled a filming pause, the atmosphere shifted slightly. Mom immediately began serving, ensuring Vanessa's plate was perfect first. Dad emerged from his phone to carve the turkey, though he kept glancing nervously at the cameras. David and I exchanged glances, trying to eat while keeping Lucas entertained and quiet. The conversation flowed in its predictable pattern. Vanessa dominated, updating everyone on her latest brand partnerships. Mom hung on every word, asking detailed questions about follower counts. I tried to contribute, sharing updates about our life, David's promotion, parenthood. My stories seemed to disappear into the air, acknowledged with polite nods before the conversation inevitably circled back to Vanessa's world. It was like trying to add ingredients to a recipe that had already been completed and plated. David noticed. He always did. He'd ask me follow-up questions, drawing me back into conversations that had moved on without me. He shared stories about base life, about our military family friends, how proud he was of me during his deployment. His efforts were kind, but they also highlighted how little interest my own family showed in my actual life. Lucas was remarkably well-behaved for a 6-month-old, content to chew on his teething toys and observe. He'd babble or laugh, drawing brief smiles before the adult conversation resumed. He was fascinated by Vanessa's lights, reaching toward them with determined focus. Midway through the main course, Vanessa wanted to film some candid family interaction. She positioned her cameraman to capture natural holiday moments. There was nothing natural about performing dinner conversation for an audience of thousands. She directed us to eat and talk normally while she provided commentary about the beautiful chaos of family gatherings. This is when things started to fall apart. Vanessa had always been particular about controlling her environment, but the filming pressure and her usual need for attention seemed to escalate her stress. She kept calling for resets if conversations didn't flow, if an expression wasn't right for the camera, if background noise interfered. Lucas, meanwhile, was getting tired. His cheerful babbling turned into that whimpering any parent recognizes as the precursor to a full meltdown. David and I tried to calm him with quiet songs and gentle bouncing. The unfamiliar environment, disrupted nap schedule, and all the unusual activity clearly overwhelmed him. I suggested taking him to the guest room to decompress, but Vanessa objected. She was in the middle of filming, the heart of the segment. People leaving would ruin the content. She assured me babies were adaptable, a little fussing was normal, and we shouldn't let it interrupt this special family time. Mom agreed, adding I was being overly cautious. Dad nodded without looking up. David's jaw tightened slightly, that look he got when choosing his words carefully. He gently suggested a short break from filming. But Vanessa was already pivoting to a more authentic approach. She'd incorporate Lucas's fussing into her narrative about the beautiful messiness of real family life. She began speaking to her camera about how holidays with little ones required flexibility and patience, how unexpected moments often made the best memories. Lucas's whimpering escalated to full-blown crying. The tired, overwhelmed sobbing that breaks a parent's heart. I reached for him instinctively, but Vanessa held up her hand to stop me. She was still filming, still trying to capture her authentic moment of holiday chaos. She seemed to think Lucas's distress added authenticity, proof that her celebrations were real and unfiltered. David's face had gone completely still. It was the expression he wore when dealing with difficult situations in his command. He was watching Vanessa with the careful attention he usually reserved for assessing threats. I could see him calculating, weighing options, trying to find a diplomatic solution that would protect his son without creating a larger conflict. I tried again to reach Lucas. Again, Vanessa stopped me. This time she was more direct, explaining I was being dramatic. A little crying never hurt anyone. She reminded me she had experience with children, too, having babysat in high school, and sometimes parents needed to relax their overprotective instincts. Lucas's crying intensified. The desperate wailing of a baby who had reached his limit. The sound filled the dining room, competing with Vanessa's continued commentary about embracing the chaos. She seemed oblivious to the fact that everyone else had stopped eating, stopped pretending, stopped participating in her performance. That's when it happened. Vanessa, clearly frustrated that Lucas's crying was overwhelming her audio and disrupting her carefully planned segment, leaned across the table. Her hand moved so quickly I wasn't sure what I'd seen. The sharp crack of her palm against Lucas's cheek echoed through the suddenly silent room. Lucas's crying stopped instantly, replaced by a shocked silence. The air seemed sucked from the room. Then came a wail unlike anything I'd ever heard from him. A sound of pure bewilderment and pain that pierced straight through my soul. His tiny cheek was already turning red where she'd struck him. Nobody moved. Mom sat frozen, fork halfway to her mouth. Dad's eyes were wide with shock, but he stayed in his chair. The cameraman kept filming, unsure whether to stop. Vanessa herself seemed momentarily stunned. But David moved. He rose from his chair with the controlled precision of someone trained for high-pressure situations. No rush, no sudden explosion. Just the deliberate unfolding of a man who had made a decision. His 6'3" frame seemed to fill the room. His dress uniform made him appear even more imposing in the suddenly silent dining room. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried the kind of authority that made people listen without question. "Turn off the camera." It wasn't a request. The cameraman immediately complied, the red recording light disappearing as the room fell into an even deeper silence. David walked around the table to where Lucas sat sobbing. He lifted our son with the gentle competence of a father who had comforted him through countless nights, holding him against his chest and murmuring soft reassurances. Lucas's cries began to subside, almost immediately. "Vanessa," David said, his voice still calm, but with an edge that made everyone sit up straighter. "You just struck my infant son." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I need you to explain to me why you thought that was acceptable." Vanessa's face had gone through several color changes, from pale shock to defensive red. "He was being disruptive," she said, her voice higher than usual. "I was trying to teach him that crying isn't appropriate at the dinner table. Sometimes children need clear boundaries." "He's 6 months old," David replied, still in that eerily calm tone. "He doesn't understand boundaries. He understands that someone hurt him." He adjusted Lucas gently, checking his cheek, where a faint red mark was still visible. "And you struck him hard enough to leave a mark." The room remained frozen. Everyone waited. Mom finally found her voice, though it was a whisper. "Vanessa, honey, you shouldn't have." "Don't," David interrupted, not raising his voice, but somehow commanding immediate attention. "Don't minimize this. Don't excuse it. And don't you dare suggest that what just happened was acceptable in any way." He turned back to Vanessa, who was now looking around the room as if searching for support that wasn't coming. "You are going to pack up your equipment and leave now. And you are not going to come near my family again until you can explain to me how you plan to ensure this never happens again." Vanessa's mouth opened and closed. "You can't just... this is my family, too. You can't ban me from family gatherings." Her voice gained strength, defensive anger replacing shock. "You're being completely unreasonable. It was barely a tap. You're acting like I committed some terrible crime." David's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Anyone who'd served under his command would recognize the warning signs. Barely a tap that left a mark on my infant son's face," he said. "A tap administered because he was crying, which is literally the only way babies have to communicate distress." He looked around the table, his gaze settling on each family member. "And not one of you moved to stop her. Not one of you said a word. You all sat here and watched someone strike a baby, and you're now trying to minimize it because she's family." The truth of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Mom's face crumpled with something that might have been shame. Dad finally looked up, though he couldn't quite meet David's gaze. Vanessa's defensive anger wavered, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. But it was too late. David had made his decision. "Natalie," he said, turning to me with an expression that was gentle, despite everything. "Lucas's things. We're leaving." He paused, looking back at the family that had just revealed its true nature. "And we won't be coming back." I stood on shaking legs, my whole body still processing. Lucas was calm now in David's arms, but I could see the confusion in his wide eyes. The way he kept touching his cheek where Vanessa had hit him. The sight of it sent a wave of protective fury through me I'd never experienced before. As I gathered our things, I heard voices from the dining room. Vanessa's raised in justification. Mom's pleading. David's still calm, but immovable. By the time I returned, David was by the front door with Lucas. Our diaper bag slung over his shoulder. His face was set in that expression I'd learned meant the discussion was over. Vanessa stood near the dining room doorway, face blotchy with tears and anger, while Mom hovered, wringing her hands. "This is insane," Vanessa called out as we headed toward the door. "You're destroying our family over nothing. Over absolutely nothing. He's fine. Look at him. He's not even crying anymore." David stopped at the threshold and turned back one final time. "The fact that you think striking a baby is nothing tells me everything I need to know about your judgment," he said. "And the fact that the rest of this family is willing to excuse it tells me everything I need to know about their priorities." He opened the door and gestured for me to go ahead. As we walked toward our car, I heard Mom calling after us, begging us to come back, to talk this through, to not let one incident ruin the holiday. But David's stride never faltered. Neither did mine. We drove home in silence. Lucas sleeping peacefully in his car seat, his cheek bearing only the faintest pink mark. David's hands gripped the steering wheel, his jaw set in that grim line that meant he was working through something difficult. It wasn't until we were safely back in our own home, Lucas fed and settled in his crib, that the full weight of what had happened hit me. I sat on our couch, still in the dress I'd chosen for Christmas dinner, and began to cry. Not just for that evening, but for all the years of feeling invisible, dismissed, and overlooked by people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. David sat beside me and pulled me close without saying anything. He understood that sometimes there were no words. Comfort was just about being present and steady. "I'm proud of you," I finally whispered against his shoulder. For what? For standing up. For protecting him. For not letting them minimize what happened. I pulled back to look at him. I don't think anyone has ever defended me like that before. His expression softened in a way that was reserved just for quiet moments between us. That's what real family does, Nat. They protect each other. They don't excuse abuse. And they don't ask you to tolerate the intolerable for the sake of peace. Later that night, replaying the evening's events, I realized David was right about more than just that moment. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a lifetime of experiences with people who demanded my silence, my accommodation, my willingness to accept less than I deserved. But this time had been different. This time, someone had stood up. Someone had said no. Someone had made it clear that the behavior was unacceptable, and there would be consequences. As I drifted off to sleep next to my husband, our baby safe in the next room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the solid peace that comes from knowing your boundaries are respected and your worth is recognized. What I didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. The events of that Christmas dinner would set in motion a series of discoveries that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my past, and my own strength. 3 days later, the war began. It started with a phone call while David was feeding Lucas his morning bottle, and I was staring at the untouched Christmas presents under our tree. Mom's voice sounded strained, almost breathless, like she'd been rehearsing. "Natalie, honey, I know you're upset, but we need to talk about what happened. Vanessa feels terrible. She didn't sleep at all last night. She wants to apologize properly, but she can't do that if you won't answer her call." I held the phone away from my ear, looking at David, who watched me with concern. Lucas made happy gurgling sounds, unaware of the tension. The red mark on his cheek had faded, but I could still see it. "Mom," I said finally. "She hit my baby. She struck a 6-month-old child because he was crying. I'm not sure what there is to discuss. She barely touched him, Natalie. You're making this into something much bigger than it was. People make mistakes when they're stressed. You know how important her work is to her, and having the filming disrupted her work." I interrupted, feeling heat rise in my chest. "Mom." She slapped Lucas across the face because he was interfering with her social media content. "Do you hear how that sounds?" Mom's sigh came through the phone like static. "You've always been dramatic about these things, sweetheart. Ever since you were little, you've blown situations out of proportion. Vanessa was just trying to teach him some boundaries. Sometimes children need firm guidance." The phrase hit me like cold water. "You've always been dramatic." How many times had I heard those words? How many times had my legitimate concerns been dismissed with that exact explanation? I gripped the phone tighter. "He's 6 months old, Mom. He doesn't understand boundaries. He understands that someone hurt him for expressing a basic need." "Now you sound like David," Mom said, and there was something in her tone that made me pause. "He's always been very rigid about rules and procedures. Military men often are. But families work differently than the army, Natalie. Families require flexibility and forgiveness." David looked up from Lucas's bottle, one eyebrow raised. He'd clearly heard enough to catch his name. I saw him making mental notes, like gathering intelligence. "What does David have to do with this?" I asked. "Well, he's the one who made the big scene. Vanessa said he was completely unreasonable, ordering people around like he was commanding troops. She said he threatened to ban her from the family." Mom's voice trailed off, as if she couldn't find words for how inappropriate she found David's behavior. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Mom, David protected our son from someone who had just hit him. That's what fathers do. That's what anyone should do when they see a child being hurt. But Vanessa is family, honey. Family means giving people second chances. It means not letting one mistake destroy relationships that have been built over decades. David doesn't understand that because he didn't grow up with us. He doesn't know how we handle things." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, each exchange making me feel more disoriented. Mom painted a picture of events that bore little resemblance to what I'd witnessed. In her version, Vanessa had barely made contact. Everyone had overreacted, and David had turned a minor family disagreement into a major crisis through his inflexibility and outsider's perspective. When I finally hung up, David watched me with the expression he wore after debriefing from a difficult mission. "Let me guess," he said. "It's our fault." "According to my mother, yes. Vanessa feels terrible, but I'm being dramatic, and you're being controlling because you don't understand how families work." David set down Lucas's empty bottle and lifted him to his shoulder for burping. "And how do families work, according to her?" "Apparently, they work by excusing abuse and expecting the victims to be understanding about it." I slumped against the kitchen counter, feeling exhausted despite being awake for less than 2 hours. "She actually said that you don't understand family dynamics because you didn't grow up with them." "She's right about that," David said quietly. "I didn't grow up with them. I grew up in a family where adults protected children instead of making excuses for people who hurt them." The difference hit me with unexpected force. David's family had its own challenges, but I'd never heard his parents dismiss abuse or ask victims to be more understanding. His grandmother, Eleanor, had been fiercely protective, never tolerating harm. The phone rang again an hour later. This time, it was Dad, speaking in the careful tone he used to mediate. He'd clearly been coached by Mom, because his words had a rehearsed quality. "Natalie, I think we all need to take a step back and look at this situation more objectively. Your mother told me about her conversation with you this morning, and it sounds like there might be some miscommunication about what actually happened yesterday." "Dad, there's no miscommunication. Vanessa hit Lucas. Multiple people saw it happen. There's nothing unclear about the situation." "Well, that's just it. Vanessa said she was just trying to get his attention, maybe redirect his fussing. She said she might have been a little firmer than necessary, but she never intended to hurt him. And honestly, looking at him now, he seems fine. Children are resilient." I found myself staring at the ceiling, trying to process the cognitive dissonance of having my own father explain to me what had happened to my own child. "Dad, intent doesn't matter when we're talking about hitting a baby. The impact matters. The fact that she thought striking him was an appropriate response to crying matters. But that's the thing, sweetheart. She's not experienced with babies. She was just trying to help in the moment. Sometimes people make poor choices when they're trying to handle unfamiliar situations." The conversation followed the same pattern as Mom's. Every concern I raised was met with an explanation for why it wasn't really a problem. Every time I tried to center Lucas's well-being, the discussion was redirected to Vanessa's feelings, her inexperience, her stress levels, her good intentions. By the time Dad hung up, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Had I misunderstood? Was I overreacting? The voices of my parents, people I'd trusted my entire life, were telling me my perceptions were wrong, my protective instincts misguided, my husband's response disproportionate. David found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at my phone with an expression he later told me looked like shell shock. He'd finished settling Lucas for his morning nap and came to check on me, immediately recognizing that something had shifted. "What did your dad say?" he asked. "He said that Vanessa didn't mean to hurt Lucas, that she was just trying to help, that maybe she was a little firmer than necessary, but children are resilient." I repeated the words in a flat tone, as if saying them might help me make sense of them. David was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Then he asked, "What do you think happened yesterday?" The question surprised me, not because I didn't know the answer, but because no one else had asked me what I thought. Everyone had been telling me what to think, explaining what had really happened, correcting my understanding of events I'd witnessed with my own eyes. "I think my sister hit my baby because he was crying and it was interfering with her filming. I think it was hard enough to leave a mark and shock him into silence. I think it was completely inappropriate and potentially harmful." I paused, feeling some clarity return as I spoke my own truth out loud. "And I think my parents are more interested in protecting Vanessa from consequences than they are in protecting Lucas from being hurt again. That's what I think." "That's what I think too," David said. "So the question is, do you trust your own perceptions, or do you trust people who are telling you that what you saw didn't really happen?" It was a fair question, but devastating. The people asking me to doubt my own perceptions were my parents, people who had shaped my understanding of right and wrong my entire life. The person supporting my perceptions was my husband, someone I'd known for 5 years, but who had consistently demonstrated better judgment and clearer moral boundaries than my family of origin. The third phone call came that afternoon, and this time it was Vanessa herself. Her voice was thick with tears, trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. This was the sister I remembered from childhood, vulnerable, seeking connection, rather than the polished influencer persona. Nat, I feel so horrible about what happened. I haven't been able to eat or sleep since yesterday. I keep replaying it in my mind, wondering how I could have handled things differently. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would be the conversation where she acknowledged what had happened and took responsibility. Maybe we could find a way forward. I'm glad you called, Vanessa. Lucas is okay, but I was really shocked by what happened. I need to understand why you thought hitting him was an appropriate response to his crying. That's just it, she said, her voice gaining strength. I don't think I really hit him. I think I just touched his cheek to get his attention. And maybe because everyone was so tense about the filming, it seemed like more than it was. You know how these things can get blown out of proportion when emotions are running high. The hope evaporated. She wasn't calling to apologize or take responsibility. She was calling to continue the family narrative, that what I'd witnessed hadn't really happened. Vanessa, there was a sound when your hand made contact with his face. There was a mark on his cheek. He went from crying to completely silent in shock before he started wailing. That's not a gentle touch to get someone's attention. But that's what I'm trying to tell you. I think everyone's perception was distorted by the stress of the situation. The cameras, the disrupted filming, David's reaction. It all created this atmosphere where a normal interaction got interpreted as something much more serious. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. Are you saying I imagined the mark on my baby's face? I'm saying that maybe what looked like a mark was just the natural redness that comes from crying. Maybe what sounded like a slap was just the sound of contact that seemed louder because the room was so quiet. Maybe what felt like a big deal in the moment isn't actually as serious as it seemed. The conversation continued for 20 more minutes. Vanessa had crafted an alternative narrative where her actions were completely reasonable and everyone else's reactions were excessive. She'd convinced herself she was the victim of misunderstanding, possibly even a conspiracy to make her look bad. When I finally ended the call, I felt like I'd been wrestling with smoke. Every time I tried to pin down what had actually happened, she redirected the conversation to interpretations, perceptions, and alternative explanations that made my own memories feel unreliable. David found me in Lucas's nursery, standing over his crib and watching him sleep. He was lying on his back, one tiny fist curled near his face, completely peaceful and trusting. The sight of him, so small and defenseless, crystallized something inside me that had been building all day. She's gaslighting me, I said without turning around. All of them are. They're trying to make me believe that what I saw didn't really happen. Yes, David said quietly. They are. Why would they do that? Why would my own family try to make me doubt my own perceptions about something this serious? David joined me at the crib. Because acknowledging what really happened would require them to take action. Action they're not willing to take. It would mean holding Vanessa accountable, which might disrupt their family dynamic. It would mean admitting they failed to protect Lucas, which would force them to examine their own behavior. So instead, they make you the problem. The fourth call came that evening, just as David and I were settling in to watch a movie. This time, it was Mom again, but her tone had shifted from pleading to frustrated. The careful diplomacy was replaced by something sharper. Natalie, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I'm concerned about how you're handling this situation. You're being very rigid and unforgiving, which isn't like you. I'm wondering if maybe the stress of new motherhood is affecting your judgment. I felt David tense beside me. The suggestion that my judgment was compromised by postpartum issues was a particularly low blow. Mom, my judgment is fine. My priorities are clear. Protecting my child from people who think it's acceptable to hit him isn't negotiable. But that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're characterizing this as hitting when it was clearly something much less serious. You're creating conflict where none needs to exist. You're making choices that are going to damage family relationships permanently over something that could be resolved with basic communication and forgiveness. What would resolution look like to you? I asked, genuinely curious. Vanessa apologizes for the misunderstanding. You accept that she didn't mean any harm. David acknowledges that his reaction was excessive, and we all move forward with better communication and more patience for each other's differences. I let that sink in. In Mom's vision, everyone bore equal responsibility. Vanessa would offer a non-apology. I would accept blame. David would admit to overreacting. Lucas, the actual victim, would be completely absent from the conversation. What about Lucas? I asked, "What does resolution look like for him?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what protections would be put in place to ensure this doesn't happen again? What boundaries would be established to keep him safe at future family gatherings? What accountability measures would ensure that Vanessa has processed why hitting a baby is never acceptable?" Mom was quiet. Then, impatiently, "You're overthinking this. He's fine. He's not going to remember any of this. You're creating trauma where none exists." And there it was, the heart of our fundamental disagreement. In my family's worldview, trauma only existed if the victim remembered it clearly. A baby couldn't be truly harmed. Adults' comfort and family harmony took precedence over protecting children from experiences they might not remember. After I hung up, David and I sat in silence. The movie we'd planned to watch remained paused. This wasn't going to blow over. My family wasn't going to understand why their response was inadequate. We had to make decisions about how to move forward with people who fundamentally disagreed with our basic values about protecting children. "I feel like I'm going crazy," I admitted. 3 different people have told me that what I saw didn't really happen. People I've trusted my entire life are asking me to doubt my own perceptions. "That's the point," David said. "They need you to doubt yourself, because if you trust what you saw, you'll make choices they don't want you to make. If you believe Lucas was actually hurt, you'll protect him from people who might hurt him again. They can't have that. But why? Why is protecting Vanessa from consequences more important than protecting Lucas from being hurt?" David was quiet for a long time. "I think your family has spent a long time organizing itself around managing Vanessa's needs and emotions. She's the center of attention, the source of drama, the person everyone has to accommodate. Protecting that system is more important than protecting individual members who threaten it." His observation hit me with uncomfortable accuracy. Growing up, family decisions were often based on how they would affect Vanessa's mood. I'd accepted this dynamic as normal. It had never occurred to me that this support system could become so entrenched that it would prioritize Vanessa's comfort over a baby's safety. The next morning brought a text message that shattered any hope I'd had for reconciliation. It was from Chloe Martinez, our neighbor at Fort Henderson and a close friend. The message was brief but devastating. "Saw Vanessa's Instagram story. Are you okay?" I opened Instagram with shaking hands, navigating to Vanessa's account. The story was titled "Family Drama and Moving Forward." It was a carefully crafted narrative about the challenges of blending families with different parenting styles. She talked about holiday gatherings, the stress of documenting family moments, and the importance of forgiveness and grace when misunderstandings occur. According to her, there had been a minor disagreement about appropriate behavior, escalated by miscommunication. She painted herself as someone trying to help a fussy baby who had been misunderstood by overprotective parents unfamiliar with extended family dynamics. She never mentioned hitting Lucas, never acknowledged harm, and characterized the entire conflict as a learning experience about family communication. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive. Her followers praised her maturity, her grace, her commitment to family. Several shared their own stories about in-law conflicts, offering advice about setting boundaries and managing different parenting philosophies. I screenshotted the entire story before it could disappear, then sat staring at my phone in disbelief. Less than 12 hours after what had felt like a breakthrough conversation about accountability, Vanessa had publicly reframed the entire incident as a misunderstanding caused by my overreaction and David's inflexibility. She had taken our private conversation about her poor judgment and transformed it into a public narrative about other people's unreasonable expectations. She had positioned herself as the victim of family drama rather than the adult who had struck a baby. And she had done it all while maintaining plausible deniability, never technically lying while also never telling the truth. When David came home from his morning run and found me crying at the kitchen table, I showed him the phone without saying anything. He read through the Instagram story twice, his expression growing grim with each sentence. "She played you," he said finally. The late-night call, the apparent acknowledgement, the promise to be more mindful, all of it designed to get information she could use to craft this narrative. I felt foolish for having believed it represented genuine remorse. But more than that, I felt betrayed by someone I'd loved and trusted since childhood, someone who had used my willingness to give her another chance as an opportunity to further manipulate the situation. The phone started ringing again, but this time I didn't answer. It was Mom, probably calling to discuss Vanessa's Instagram story and encourage me to see it as a positive step. But I was done listening to explanations about why my perceptions were wrong and my boundaries unreasonable. Instead, I did something I'd never done before in a family conflict. I started documenting everything. I wrote down exactly what had happened at Christmas dinner, including direct quotes. I saved screenshots of Vanessa's Instagram story and the supportive comments. I made notes about each phone conversation, including the specific language my family members had used to minimize the incident and question my judgment. For the first time, I was treating my family like potential adversaries rather than trusted allies. And as I organized the evidence, I began to understand that this pattern had been happening for much longer than just the past few days. This was how they had always handled conflicts that threatened their preferred narrative. This was how they had always managed situations where Vanessa's behavior created problems. This was how they had trained me over decades to doubt my own perceptions and prioritize family harmony over my own well-being. But this time was different. This time, the victim wasn't just me. It was my infant son. Someone who couldn't advocate for himself or choose to walk away from a harmful situation. This time I had a partner who supported my perceptions and validated my concerns, rather than asking me to be more understanding of people who had hurt us. And this time I was going to fight back. The documentation process revealed patterns I hadn't consciously recognized. As I scrolled through old text messages and social media posts, a clear picture emerged of how my family had been managing conflicts for years. Every time Vanessa created a problem, the same cycle played out. Initial shock, followed by explanations and excuses, then pressure on everyone else to accommodate her version of events. I found a text thread from 2 years earlier, when Vanessa had shown up 4 hours late to Grandma Eleanor's memorial service because she'd been filming a collaboration with a makeup brand. Instead of addressing her disrespect, the family had spent the entire reception discussing how grief affects people differently. My hurt feelings about her absence were reframed as selfishness. Another thread from last spring revealed a similar pattern when Vanessa had borrowed Mom's car and returned it with significant damage. The family conversation focused on accidents happen, and material possessions weren't worth damaging relationships. Mom ended up paying the deductible herself. The more I looked, the clearer it became that I had been trained to accept this dynamic as normal. I'd learned to minimize my own needs, question my own perceptions, and prioritize everyone else's comfort over my own well-being. The Christmas dinner incident wasn't an anomaly. It was the most extreme example of a pattern that had been shaping my life for decades. David found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by printed screenshots and handwritten notes, creating what looked like a case file. He poured himself coffee and sat down, studying my organized evidence. "This looks like intelligence gathering," he observed. "That's exactly what it is. I'm trying to understand how they do this, how they consistently manage to make me feel like I'm the problem when they're the ones causing harm." I gestured to a timeline I'd created of family conflicts. "Look at this pattern. Every single time, the same thing happened." David examined the timeline, noting the recurring elements. Incident, denial, reframing, pressure to forgive, eventual acceptance of the family narrative. It's sophisticated. They've created a system that protects Vanessa from consequences while training everyone else to doubt their own judgment. But why me specifically? Why am I always the one being asked to be more understanding, more forgiving, more flexible? Because you're the one who challenges. You're the one who notices when things don't add up. You're the one who asks uncomfortable questions. He pointed to several incidents on my timeline. "Look at these. In every case, you were the person who initially called out the problematic behavior. They need to neutralize you because you're the threat to their system." The observation hit me with uncomfortable accuracy. I had always been the family member who pointed out inconsistencies, who asked why certain behaviors were acceptable, who pushed for accountability. I thought of myself as helpful. But from the family's perspective, I was a disruptor who threatened their carefully maintained equilibrium. My phone buzzed with another text from Mom. "Honey, I saw that you read Vanessa's Instagram story. I hope you can see that she's really trying to move forward in a positive way. Maybe we could all get together this weekend to talk through everything calmly." I showed the message to David, who shook his head. "They're trying to reset the narrative again. Get everyone in the same room, apply social pressure, and convince you to accept their version of events for the sake of family peace. But what if I'm wrong? What if I am being too rigid, too unforgiving? What if there really is a way to work through this that doesn't require cutting people out of our lives?" David set down his coffee cup and looked at me seriously. Let me ask you something. If one of my soldiers struck a baby during a family gathering and then spent the next week convincing everyone that it hadn't really happened while publicly reframing themselves as the victim, what would you think I should do? The question clarified everything instantly. If this were happening to anyone else's family, if I were watching from the outside, I would be horrified by the gaslighting and manipulation. I would advise them to protect their child and maintain clear boundaries with people who refuse to acknowledge harmful behavior. I would tell them to document everything and stay away from people who think hitting babies is negotiable. I'd tell them to run, I answered. Right. So why is your family different? I didn't have a good answer. The only reason I was considering compromise was because these were people I'd loved my entire life. People whose approval I'd sought since childhood. People whose rejection felt like losing a fundamental part of my identity. But none of those reasons justified exposing Lucas to people who might hurt him again. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Chloe Martinez. She'd been following the situation and had information that changed everything. Natalie, I need to tell you something, but I'm not sure how you're going to take it. I've been going through Vanessa's social media more carefully, and I found some posts from earlier this year that I think you need to see. She sent me screenshots of several posts from Vanessa's account dating back to when Lucas was first born. One showed a professional photo shoot she'd done using baby props, captioned with something about the beauty of new beginnings and the joy of expanding family. Another featured her holding what appeared to be a newborn, with text about the blessings of being an aunt. The problem was the timing. Both posts had been published weeks before Lucas was actually born, using stock photos and borrowed babies to create content about an experience she hadn't had yet. She'd been monetizing her relationship with my unborn child, creating sponsored content about our family moments before they'd even happened. There's more, Chloe said when I called her back. I found a whole series of posts about family traditions, holiday celebrations, and multi-generational gatherings that all feature photos from Christmas dinner last year, the one you and David missed because of his deployment. She's been creating this narrative about close family relationships that doesn't actually exist. I felt sick looking at the evidence. Vanessa had built a brand around family content that portrayed relationships and experiences that were largely fiction. Her followers believed she was documenting authentic moments, but she was actually crafting carefully staged content designed to generate engagement and sponsorship opportunities. The Christmas dinner incident started making more sense in this context. Vanessa hadn't just been filming for personal documentation. She'd been creating content for a business that depended on maintaining a specific image of family harmony and celebration. Lucas's crying had threatened not just her filming schedule, but her entire brand identity. When David came home that evening, I showed him everything Chloe had discovered. He studied the evidence with the methodical attention he gave to intelligence briefings, noting dates, inconsistencies, and patterns that revealed the scope of Vanessa's deception. She's been using your family as content for months, he said. And not just documenting real experiences. She's been creating fictional narratives about relationships that exist primarily for her audience. Which means the Christmas dinner wasn't about family time at all. It was about creating content that would support her. Lucas and I were just props in her production. And when Lucas interfered with the production by acting like a normal baby, she prioritized her content over his well-being. The realization was devastating, but also clarifying. This hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment by someone who cared about us, but was overwhelmed by stress. This had been a calculated decision by someone who viewed our family as raw material for her business, and who was willing to harm a child to protect her commercial interest. I spent the evening going through more of Vanessa's content, documenting the extent to which she'd been monetizing our family relationships without our knowledge or consent. She'd used photos of our wedding, stories about David's deployment, and speculation about our future children to create sponsored posts about military families and the importance of family support. Most disturbing were the posts about grandparents and family traditions, which portrayed mom and dad as deeply involved, loving grandparents, despite the fact that they'd shown minimal interest in actually developing relationships with Lucas. The gap between Vanessa's public narrative and our private reality was enormous. But her followers had no way of knowing that the family closeness she documented was largely performative. The next morning brought a series of texts from various family members, all encouraging me to attend a family meeting Mom had scheduled for the weekend. The messages used remarkably similar language about healing communication and moving forward together, suggesting they'd been coordinated. but I was done being managed. Instead of responding, I called my family's insurance company to report the incident involving Lucas. I wasn't planning to file a claim, but I wanted it documented. The representative was professional but clearly disturbed, asking multiple times if I needed resources for child protection services. I also called our pediatrician, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, to schedule a consultation. When I explained what had happened, she immediately scheduled an appointment and asked me to bring photos of any marks or bruises. The pediatric appointment was both validating and heartbreaking. Dr. Walsh examined Lucas carefully, documented the fading mark on his cheek, and asked detailed questions. Her concern was serious, regardless of intent or family relationship. Parents need to trust their protective instincts, she told me. When something feels wrong, it usually is wrong. Your job is to keep Lucas safe, not to manage other people's feelings about your safety measures. She also provided me with resources about family violence and information about documenting incidents for potential legal proceedings. I hadn't considered legal action, but having the information felt empowering after days of being told my concerns were overblown. That afternoon, I received a call from Captain Ryan Torres, one of David's closest colleagues. He and his wife Maria had become good friends. "Natalie, I hope you don't mind me calling, but Maria and I wanted you to know that we're behind you 100%. What happened to Lucas is unacceptable, and the way your family is handling it is concerning." I felt a wave of relief hearing validation from someone outside the situation. After days of being told I was overreacting, it was powerful to hear from other parents who found the incident as disturbing as I did. Thank you, Ryan. I've been starting to doubt my own judgment about everything. Don't. You're a good mother, and you're doing exactly what you should be doing. David is lucky to have a partner who will stand up for their child, even when it's difficult. Ryan also shared that David had been consulting with military legal services about options for protecting our family. The military took family violence seriously, and there were resources available for service members dealing with civilian family conflicts that might affect their security clearance or job performance. The conversation helped me realize that David and I weren't alone. We had a community of people who shared our values about protecting children and maintaining clear boundaries. Our chosen family was standing behind us, even if our family of origin was not. That evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I drafted a group text to Mom, Dad, and Vanessa, clearly stating our boundaries going forward. The message was calm but firm, explaining that we would not be attending family gatherings until Vanessa acknowledged what had happened and demonstrated genuine accountability. The response was immediate and intense. My phone began buzzing with calls and messages within minutes. Mom called first, her voice high with panic, begging me not to destroy the family over a misunderstanding. Dad texted, asking me to reconsider such a drastic response to what he called a minor incident. Vanessa sent a series of messages alternating between anger and hurt, accusing me of being vindictive and manipulative. But the message that stopped me cold came from Aunt Linda. Her text was brief but devastating. Saw the Instagram situation. "This isn't the first time. Call me when you're ready to hear about the others." I stared at the message for several minutes before showing it to David. "What others?" he asked. "I have no idea, but Linda wouldn't say something like that unless she had specific information." I called Linda immediately, my hands shaking. She answered on the first ring. "Natalie, honey, I've been watching the situation unfold, and I think it's time you knew some things about your family that they've been keeping from you." "What kind of things?" Linda was quiet for a moment. "There have been other incidents over the years. Times when Vanessa hurt people, usually children, and the family covered it up or explained it away. I never said anything because it wasn't my place. But watching them do it to your baby, I can't stay quiet anymore." The conversation that followed lasted for 2 hours and changed everything I thought I knew about my family history. Linda told me about incidents dating back to when Vanessa was a teenager. Times when she'd been rough with younger cousins, inappropriate with kids at family gatherings. In every case, the family had intervened to minimize the situation and protect Vanessa. Parents were told their children were dramatic or oversensitive. Witnesses were asked to keep quiet for family harmony. Vanessa was coached on what to say, but never actually held accountable. "I've watched your parents train that girl to believe she can hurt people without consequences," Linda said. "And I've watched them train everyone else to accept it." She continued, "When I saw what happened at Christmas dinner and then saw how they were handling it, I knew it was time to speak up. Linda also revealed something that explained a lot about the family dynamic. Vanessa had been born with some developmental delays that had required extensive early intervention and special education services. Mom and Dad had spent years advocating for her, fighting for accommodations, and protecting her from situations where she might struggle. The problem was that they'd never transitioned from protecting a child with special needs to holding an adult accountable for harmful behavior. They'd continued making excuses and providing accommodations long past the point where Vanessa was capable of understanding and controlling her actions. She knows exactly what she's doing, Linda said. She's learned that if she can make people feel sorry for her, or if she can convince them that she's just misunderstood, she can get away with almost anything. And your parents enable it because they've spent so many years seeing her as vulnerable that they can't recognize when she's being manipulative. By the time I hung up with Linda, I felt like I'd been given a completely different map of my family territory. Suddenly, decades of confusing interactions made sense. The pattern of protecting Vanessa at everyone else's expense wasn't just a recent development. It was a system that had been refined over years. More importantly, Linda's information made it clear that Lucas wasn't Vanessa's first victim, and he wouldn't be her last if the family continued enabling her behavior. The Christmas dinner incident wasn't an isolated mistake. It was the latest example of a long-standing pattern that had been hidden from me because I'd been too young, too distant, or too willing to accept family explanations. The next morning, I woke up with absolute clarity. I wasn't just protecting Lucas from one bad incident. I was breaking a generational cycle of abuse and enablement that had been damaging children in my family for years. I called Linda back and asked if she would be willing to document what she'd told me, to provide written statements. She agreed immediately, saying she'd been carrying the guilt of staying silent for too long. I also reached out to other family members who might have information. Some were reluctant, but others were relieved to finally talk about things they'd witnessed. By the end of the week, I had a comprehensive picture of how my family had been protecting Vanessa from consequences while putting other people's children at risk. I had written statements from multiple witnesses, documentation of previous incidents, and clear evidence that the Christmas dinner event was part of a much larger pattern. David and I spent that weekend planning our next step. We weren't interested in revenge or public humiliation, but we were committed to protecting Lucas and preventing future incidents. We decided to share our documentation with family members who had children, to give them the information they needed to make informed decisions about their own safety. We also made the decision to maintain our boundaries, regardless of how the family responded. Linda's information had made it clear that this wasn't a problem that could be solved with better communication or more understanding. This was a problem that required fundamental changes in accountability and consequences. Changes that my family had shown no willingness to make. Most importantly, we decided to build our own family traditions and support systems that didn't depend on people who prioritized maintaining dysfunction over protecting children. Lucas deserved to grow up in an environment where his safety was never negotiable, where adults took responsibility for their actions, and where his well-being wasn't sacrificed for someone else's comfort. As I organized the evidence and prepared to share it with relevant family members, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of having complete information and the power to act on it. I was no longer the confused family member being told that my perceptions were wrong. I was someone who understood exactly what was happening and why, and who had the resources to respond appropriately. The war that had begun with a slapped baby was about to become a battle for the truth. And for the first time since Christmas dinner, I felt confident about which side would win. The breaking point came when I received a certified letter from Vanessa's attorney, demanding I cease what they called a defamation campaign against their client. The letter claimed I was spreading false information about the Christmas dinner and damaging Vanessa's professional reputation. I stared at the legal letterhead in disbelief. I hadn't posted anything online. Hadn't spoken to anyone outside immediate family except close friends who asked direct questions. The only campaign I'd conducted was documenting actual events and sharing factual information with relatives who had young children. David read the letter over my shoulder, his expression growing darker. "They're trying to intimidate you into silence," he said. "This is what people do when they know they're guilty, but can't afford to have the truth come out." The letter demanded I sign a statement acknowledging that no assault had occurred, that any claims about Vanessa striking Lucas were fabricated, and that I would refrain from making any future statements that could damage her business interests. In exchange, they wouldn't pursue legal action for defamation and intentional interference with business relationships. Business relationships, I repeated, feeling the full weight of what this revealed. She's not worried about family harmony or healing relationships. She's worried about her brand and her income stream. That afternoon, I called the law office of Janet Morrison, an attorney Linda had recommended. Janet agreed to see me immediately. The letter is largely bluster, she told me after reviewing my documentation. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims, and you have substantial evidence supporting your version of events. But the fact that they're escalating to legal threats suggests they're feeling genuine pressure. Janet helped me understand that Vanessa's business model depended heavily on maintaining a specific public image. If sponsors and followers learned about her history with children, the financial impact could be devastating. The legal threats weren't really about protecting her reputation. They were about protecting her income. I want you to prepare for them to escalate further, Janet warned. People with a lot to lose can become dangerous when they feel cornered. Document everything. Stay safe. And don't engage directly with any of them until we develop a comprehensive strategy. Our strategy session with Janet revealed options I hadn't considered. We could file for a restraining order. We could pursue our own legal action for intentional infliction of emotional distress. We could report the incident to Child Protective Services. Most importantly, Janet helped me understand that I wasn't required to keep family secrets that put children at risk. The evidence I'd gathered about previous incidents wasn't gossip or betrayal. It was information that other parents had a right to know when making decisions about their children's safety. That evening, I made copies of everything we'd assembled and prepared packages for family members with young children. Each package included documentation of the Christmas dinner incident, witness statements about previous events, and information about Vanessa's pattern of avoiding accountability. I wasn't asking anyone to choose sides or cut contact. I was simply providing information they could use to make informed decisions. The response was swift and explosive. Within hours of delivering the packages, my phone rang constantly. Mom called first in hysterics, demanding I explain why I was attacking Vanessa with lies and propaganda. She'd apparently seen some of the documentation and was devastated by what Linda and others had shared about incidents she thought had been successfully minimized. Those things happened years ago, she sobbed. Vanessa was just a child herself in some of those situations. She didn't understand what she was doing. Why are you dragging up ancient history to hurt her now? Because it's not ancient history, Mom. It's a pattern that's continuing today. And because other parents deserve to know about that pattern when they're making decisions about their children's safety. But she's changed. She's grown up. She would never intentionally hurt a child now. She hit Lucas 6 days ago, Mom. Whatever changes you think she's made clearly haven't addressed the fundamental problem. The conversation deteriorated, with Mom alternating between begging me to retract the information and threatening to cut me out of the family entirely. It was the same emotional manipulation I'd experienced my entire life. But this time, I recognized it for what it was and refused to be swayed. Dad's response was different, but equally revealing. He called late that night, speaking in the controlled tone he used to manage crises. His approach was more strategic than Mom's emotional appeals, focusing on practical concerns about reputation and consequences. Natalie, I understand you're upset, but this approach is going to hurt everyone, including you and David. If this information becomes public, it could affect David's military career. Have you thought about the security clearance implications of being involved in a family scandal? It was a low blow, trying to use David's professional obligations to pressure me into silence. But it also revealed how little Dad understood about military values. The military didn't penalize service members for protecting children or reporting abuse. Quite the opposite. Dad, David's career is built on integrity and protecting people who can't protect themselves. His command would be more concerned if he failed to protect his own child from someone with a history of violence. But Vanessa doesn't have a history of violence. These are isolated incidents that happened years apart, mostly when she was young herself. You're creating a narrative that makes her sound like a dangerous predator when she's just someone who's made some mistakes. Mistakes are accidents, Dad. Patterns are choices. And a pattern of hurting children, followed by a pattern of avoiding consequences, isn't something I'm going to help hide anymore. The most devastating call came from my cousin Sarah, who had been present during several of the incidents Linda had described. Sarah was now a mother of 2 young children, and she'd received one of my information packages with deep concern. "Natalie, I need you to know that I believe everything you've documented. I was there for some of those incidents, and I've been carrying guilt about staying quiet for years." Her voice was shaky but determined. "When I saw what happened to Lucas and then saw how everyone was handling it, I realized I couldn't protect my own kids if I couldn't even acknowledge what I'd witnessed." Sarah shared details about an incident from her teenage years that hadn't made it into Linda's account. During a family reunion, Vanessa had pushed Sarah's younger brother down a flight of stairs after he'd accidentally knocked over something she was filming. The boy had suffered a concussion, but the family had explained it as an accident. "I was 17 and scared of causing family drama, so I went along with the story," Sarah said. "But I've regretted it ever since. And when I had my own children, I made sure they were never alone with Vanessa." Sarah's testimony was powerful. She'd been old enough to understand and had maintained consistent memories. But Sarah also revealed something that changed my understanding of the current situation. "Natalie, there's something else you need to know. Vanessa isn't just worried about her current business. She's been in talks with a major network about a reality show centered around her family content. The Christmas dinner footage was supposed to be part of her audition reel. The information hit me like a physical blow. Vanessa hadn't just been creating content for her existing followers. She'd been filming us for a potential television show without our knowledge or consent. Lucas's first Christmas had been treated as raw material for entertainment production. And when he'd interfered by acting like a normal baby, she'd prioritized the footage over his well-being. The network executives are supposed to review her submission this week," Sarah continued. "That's probably why she's escalating the legal threats. If this information becomes public before they make their decision, it could destroy the biggest opportunity she's ever had." I shared this with David when he returned from base that evening. His reaction was immediate and intense, not anger, but the cold fury of someone who'd realized the full scope of a threat he'd underestimated. "She exploited our family for commercial purposes without our consent. And when our infant son interfered with her production, she assaulted him," he said, his voice deadly calm. "And now she's threatening legal action to prevent us from protecting other children from similar treatment." David's military training had taught him to identify and neutralize threats systematically. He approached this with the same methodical precision he brought to tactical planning. "We're not just dealing with a family conflict anymore," he told me. "We're dealing with someone who's willing to harm children for financial gain and use legal intimidation to cover it up. That makes her a legitimate threat that needs to be addressed through appropriate channels." The next morning, David contacted his command. The response was immediate and supportive. His commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, made it clear that the military expected service members to report child abuse and protect their families from ongoing threats. "The service takes these situations very seriously," Colonel Martinez told us. "We can't have personnel being blackmailed or intimidated by family members, especially when child safety is involved. We'll provide whatever support you need to resolve this appropriately." The military's backing was both practical and psychological. It meant David wouldn't face professional consequences, and it gave us access to military legal resources. More importantly, it validated our decision to prioritize child protection. That afternoon, Janet Morrison called with an update about Vanessa's legal threats. After reviewing our documentation and witness statements, she drafted a response that turned the tables completely. Instead of defending against defamation claims, we were putting Vanessa on notice about potential legal action for assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and using our family for commercial purposes without consent. "The beauty of truth as a defense," Janet explained, "is that it forces the other side to prove their claims are false. Given the evidence you've assembled, that's going to be very difficult for them to do. More likely, they'll realize that pursuing this legally will only create more public exposure of information they want to keep private." The response letter was a masterpiece of legal strategy. It acknowledged the Christmas dinner incident, detailed our evidence, and noted the pattern of similar incidents. It also informed Vanessa's attorney that we had evidence of commercial exploitation and were considering our own legal options. Most importantly, the letter made it clear that we weren't making public accusations. We were simply sharing factual information with family members who needed it. If Vanessa wanted to make it public through legal proceedings, we were prepared. The response to our letter was immediate silence. No calls, no texts, no social media activity from Vanessa. It was as if the entire Sterling family apparatus had suddenly gone dark while they figured out how to respond to a situation they couldn't control. But the silence was broken 3 days later by an unexpected development. I received a call from Jessica Chun, a producer at the network that had been considering Vanessa's reality show. She'd somehow obtained information about recent events and wanted to discuss the situation directly. "Miss Brooks, I'm calling because we've received some concerning information about your sister's family content and the authenticity of the relationships she's been documenting. Before we move forward with any business arrangements, we need to understand what actually happened during the filming session she submitted as part of her audition." I was careful to stick to facts during the conversation, confirming that the Christmas dinner had been filmed for commercial purposes, that there had been an incident involving my infant son, and that the family relationships portrayed in Vanessa's content didn't accurately reflect our actual dynamic. I didn't volunteer inflammatory details, but I answered Jessica's questions honestly. "Thank you for your honesty," Jessica said. "This information is very helpful as we evaluate our programming decisions. Networks have to be extremely careful about liability issues, especially when children are involved in content creation." 2 hours later, my phone exploded with calls and messages from my family. Word had apparently gotten back to Vanessa that the network was conducting additional research, and she was in full panic mode. Mom called, crying, begging me to contact the network. Dad sent multiple texts about family loyalty and the damage I was causing to Vanessa's dreams. But the most revealing response came from Vanessa herself, who showed up at our house unannounced that evening. David answered the door and found her on our porch, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her hands shaking with rage. "You destroyed everything," she screamed. "Years of work, hundreds of thousands of followers, business relationships I spent years building. All gone because you couldn't just let things go." "I didn't destroy anything, Vanessa. I protected my child and shared factual information with people who needed it. If that destroyed your business, maybe your business was built on lies." "It wasn't lies. It was content creation. It was storytelling. Everyone knows that social media isn't completely literal. It's about creating aspirational content that people want to engage with." David stepped between us, his posture making it clear that Vanessa needed to lower her voice. "You used our family as props for fictional content without our consent. And when our baby interfered with your production, you hit him. There's nothing aspirational about that. I barely touched him, and only because he was ruining months of work. Do you have any idea how hard it is to create authentic family content when people won't cooperate with the vision?" The admission was stunning. In her fury, Vanessa had revealed that she genuinely believed Lucas should have cooperated with her commercial filming, and that striking him was justified by the importance of her content creation. She wasn't apologetic about hurting him. She was angry that he'd failed to perform according to her expectations. "Get off our property," David said quietly. "And don't come back. You can't just cut me out of the family. I'm Lucas's aunt. You have no rights to access a child you assaulted," David replied. "And if you come here again, I'll call the police." Vanessa's mask slipped completely. The polished influencer persona, the victim narrative, the claims of misunderstanding. All of it fell away to reveal someone who genuinely believed she was entitled to use our family for her purposes. She left screaming threats about lawsuits and family consequences. But her rage had actually strengthened our position. David had recorded the entire interaction on his phone, capturing her admission about using our family for content and her anger about Lucas not cooperating with filming. The recording provided clear evidence of her mindset and priorities. Evidence that would be devastating if she actually tried to pursue legal action. That night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Christmas dinner. Complete certainty that we'd made the right choice. Vanessa's visit had stripped away any remaining doubt about her character or her commitment to changing her behavior. She wasn't sorry for hurting Lucas. She was angry that hurting Lucas had consequences. The war we'd been fighting wasn't really about one incident at Christmas dinner. It was about the right of children to be protected from adults who would harm them for personal gain. It was about the obligation of other adults to speak up when they witnessed abuse, rather than protecting the abuser for the sake of family peace. We'd chosen protection over peace, truth over comfort, and our child's safety over our family's dysfunction. The consequences were painful, but they were also liberating. For the first time in my adult life, I was free from the obligation to manage other people's emotions at the expense of my own well-being and my child's safety. The battle was far from over, but we'd established clear boundaries and assembled the resources to defend them. Most importantly, we demonstrated to ourselves and our community that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight was against people we'd once loved and trusted. Lucas would grow up in a family that prioritized his safety over social harmony, that valued truth over convenience, and that understood the difference between love and enabling. That was worth any price we had to pay. 6 months later, Lucas took his first steps in our backyard while David and I cheered from the patio. He wobbled between the garden bed and the fence, his face lit up with the pure joy of discovery. There were no cameras documenting the moment, no staged lighting, no audience beyond the two people who loved him most. It was authentic in a way that Vanessa's manufactured content never could be. The legal threats had evaporated after Vanessa's recorded admission. Janet Morrison had crafted a settlement agreement that required all parties to maintain privacy about family matters while ensuring we could share safety information with relatives who had children. Vanessa agreed to seek counseling, though I doubted she would follow through meaningfully. The reality show opportunity had disappeared entirely after the network conducted their background research. Jessica Chen later told me that they'd received multiple corroborating accounts about Vanessa's history with children, and the legal liability was too significant. The entertainment industry, despite its reputation for questionable ethics, drew hard lines around child safety. Mom and Dad had initially maintained their position that I was destroying the family over minor incidents. But as more relatives came forward with their own experiences, their narrative became increasingly difficult to sustain. Linda had organized a family meeting where several witnesses shared their accounts, creating a comprehensive picture that even my parents couldn't dismiss entirely. The meeting had been devastating for Mom, who genuinely seemed unaware of the extent of Vanessa's behavioral patterns. She'd spent years managing individual incidents as isolated problems, while missing the larger pattern. Dad, characteristically, had absorbed the information silently before retreating into his typical emotional withdrawal. Neither of my parents had apologized directly, but their approach had shifted from defending Vanessa to simply avoiding the topic entirely. They'd stopped pressuring me to reconcile and had begun interacting with Lucas during brief, supervised visits that felt stilted but safe. It wasn't the warm grandparent relationship I'd hoped for, but it was workable within our new boundaries. Vanessa herself had essentially disappeared from family dynamics. Her social media presence had shifted away from family content toward lifestyle and travel posts. She'd apparently moved to Los Angeles, though Linda reported that her follower engagement had dropped significantly after the authenticity of her content came into question. The most surprising gift had come from an unexpected source. Eleanor's sister, Margaret, now 93, had heard about our situation and requested a visit. When we met her, she shared stories about Eleanor that put our choices in historical context. Eleanor always said that family isn't about blood connections or social obligations. Margaret told us while Lucas played with toys she'd saved from her own children's childhood. She said family is about people who show up for each other when it matters, who tell the truth even when it's difficult, and who protect those who can't protect themselves. Margaret also revealed that Eleanor had been concerned about Vanessa's behavior with children for years, but had been dismissed as an interfering older relative. Eleanor would be proud of what you did, Margaret said. She always believed that protecting children was more important than maintaining comfortable lies. You honored her values, even when your own parents wouldn't. The validation from Eleanor's sister felt like a blessing. Eleanor had always combined unconditional love with clear expectations for appropriate behavior. Learning she would have supported our choices provided deep comfort during moments when I questioned whether we'd been too harsh. Now, watching Lucas navigate our backyard with the confidence of a child who'd never doubted his safety, I understood that we'd given him something invaluable. The security of knowing that the adults in his life would always prioritize his well-being over social convenience. David joined me on the patio as Lucas discovered a butterfly near the roses. Our son's delighted laughter filled the air as he tried to follow its erratic flight, stumbling occasionally, but always getting back up with determination. Any regrets? David asked quietly, though I could tell from his tone that he already knew my answer. None, I replied, watching Lucas's pure joy. Look at him. He's fearless because he knows he's protected. He's curious because he's never been punished for being a normal child. He's confident because he's never been told that his needs don't matter. David nodded, understanding the deeper implications of what we'd chosen. He'll grow up knowing that love means protection, not accommodation. That family means safety, not obligation. That his worth isn't negotiable, even with people who share his DNA. The lessons we'd learned through crisis had become the foundation for the family culture we were building. Lucas would understand that healthy relationships required mutual respect, that boundaries were expressions of self-care rather than selfishness, and that sometimes love meant saying no to people who demanded harmful compliance. As the sun set, and Lucas finally tired himself out chasing butterflies, I felt complete peace with the choices we'd made. We'd traded the familiar dysfunction of my birth family for the uncertain work of building authentic relationships, and the trade had been more than worth it. Lucas would never remember the Christmas dinner that changed everything, but he would grow up with the benefits of our decision to prioritize his safety over family harm. And he would know that his parents could be trusted to protect him, that his needs mattered, and that love never required accepting harm from others. The war that had begun with a slapped baby had ended with the victory that mattered most. A child who was safe, loved, and free to develop his own authentic self without performing for other people's emotional needs. In losing my birth family, I gained something far more valuable. The knowledge that I could build the kind of family that actually deserved the name. This was a long, painful journey, but it led us to a place of true peace and genuine connection. What about you? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting someone you love? What lines are you unwilling to cross? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I really want to hear your perspective.